Good evening, everyone, and welcome to In the Realms of the Penguin and the Polar Bear with Jean Robson, FRPS. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. We're glad to see so many of you taking the time to be with us today. In addition to members of Digital Imaging, we have many Royal Photographic Society members and non-members from all over the world. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you so you'll know how to get the best from today's event. This Zoom event has a special question and answer feature. At the bottom of your screen, or possibly the top if you're using a tablet, you will see a Q&A icon. You can click on this to ask a question at any time during Jean's presentation. At the end of Jean's presentation, there will be time for her to answer your questions. Now, we appreciate that her presentation is going to be so good that you will immediately want to thank her for it, but please don't. There will be an opportunity for your feedback after the event. So please, for today, questions only. Jean will answer as many of your questions as time permits. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Jean Robson. Since joining the University Mountaineering Club during her Freshers' Week, Jean has always loved spending time in mountainous and remote places and using photography to share those experiences with friends and family. Retirement from paid employment has given her time to develop her photographic skills, and working through the RPS distinctions process has suited her learning style. Jean enjoys photographing the natural world, both at home and on trips abroad. Tonight, she is going to share impressions of the landscapes and wildlife in some of the more remote parts of our planet. Jean, good evening. Over to you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Trevor, for that nice introduction. I'm going to crack on straight away because Janet has asked me to cover 4 trips, and that's quite a lot to do in an hour. So I'm just going to go on with no further ado. So we're going to talk about trips to Svalbard in the north, and then come down through the North Atlantic Ocean, the South Atlantic Ocean to the Falkland Islands, and then the Antarctic Peninsula. So my story starts in 2018. My husband and I were booked on a trip on a Russian icebreaker to go sailing around Svalbard. But 6 weeks before we were due to go, we got an email from the company saying your boat has been requisitioned by the Russian government. I don't think that was entirely true. However, there was no option other than to change our trip to something else. We again booked to go to Svalbard, this time with a small Norwegian company using a Swedish boat in 2020. We were aiming to go in the end of the season in 2020. But then, of course, COVID came along, so that trip was cancelled. In 2021, Svalbard still did not have its doors open to the public, so we had a trip arranged for autumn 2022, which we had a feeling was jinxed from the start. However, at the end of 2021, into my inbox suddenly fell an advertisement for a trip to Svalbard with a different Norwegian company on a ship that had recently been refurbished as an expedition ship to carry 12 photographers and 5 crew. An expedition ship just means that you don't have to get smart for dinner, and food and sleep are entirely determined by what's happening outside the ship rather than any predetermined plan. Sounded great, so we jumped at the chance and booked up to go, really believing that our autumn trip was never going to take place. However, a week after we booked, unfortunately, the Omicron variant of COVID raised its head and we were all locked down again. We didn't really know whether we were going to go or not until 6 weeks before we actually went, and then Svalbard opened its doors to the public and game was on. This was the boat that we were going to travel in, and this is the harbour. It's the maximum extent of the sea ice at the end of March, and we were there in the first few days of April. The little hut that you can see on the right is a sauna, and there were some brave young people saunaing and then jumping into the frozen harbour. We didn't try that. If you believe the advertisements given by adventure travel companies that run these sort of trips, you'd think that in the Arctic and the Antarctic regions, you've got something like 4 or 5 hours of golden hour at the beginning and end of the day, every day in the Arctic regions in the shoulder seasons. And you'd think that you saw polar bears or other exciting wildlife around every corner. However, we live in Scotland, and we know that if you're in the north, you expect with mountains that you'll get variable weather, and like wildlife does its own thing and appears when it wants to. So we went with the attitude that whatever we saw would be fantastic. And we got a lot of whiteout conditions, but still enjoyed photographing, waiting for a mountain to pop out of the incessant white cloud and waiting for a bird, a fulmar here, to just come sailing out of the clouds, one of the early arriving fulmars. Or I could just wait and see what would appear at the edge of the ice. You'd think there was no contrast in this picture. Well, that's absolutely right, because there was no contrast. There was absolutely no way of distinguishing between the sea ice, the ice on the land, and the mountains. So I just picked an edge of ice and waited for a bird or an animal to appear, and was particularly lucky during this heavy snowstorm that a walrus popped its head out as well. Other things you can do when the light is bad is pick an edge of ice and wait for reflections in the water, which gives some interesting scenes. On other days, the clouds were dark and heavy, with occasional breaks in the cloud giving a little shaft of light lighting up a bit of land. And if we were really lucky, the sea was calm enough for some reflections. On other times, a small group of guillemots early arriving for their nesting season, which doesn't really get going until a few weeks after this, are caught in a little patch of light below the dark clouds. I loved absolutely every minute of it. I stood on the deck of that ship for hours and hours and hours in temperatures between -2 and -10, just waiting for something to happen or something to change. Most of the other photographers complained about the lack of polar bears and the lack of nice, warm, tangential light, and sat around in the canteen on the boat drinking coffee. And I, at that moment, decided that I wanted to produce a body of work which would convince people that actually you don't need the fantastic warm light. The Arctic is absolutely amazing in any weather condition. Now, to create a body of work that shows that is quite a challenge when you're on a small boat at the very beginning of the season, when the fjords are full of ice, so you can't actually get the boat very close to the shore. You're confined to the deck. Occasionally, you can go up onto the top of the bridge, but only if it's not very rough, because it's very icy up there and very slippy, and you don't really want to be using two hands for photography. The other option for getting a different viewpoint is to get into a zodiac. But again, at this stage of the season, it's quite uncommon to find a suitable place where it's sufficiently suitable to get the zodiac off the ship and onto the ground. There's also no options for slow shutter speed work or multiple exposures, because the engine runs the entire time. So as well as the movement of the sea, you have the movement of the engine. So I would pick edges of ice or compositions, find a composition I'd like, and wait for a bird to fly into it. This one came over the ice, but I was really waiting for one a little bit higher up. However, they kept appearing over the sea. And another one. But one of the things that was absolutely fabulous for photography was the sea ice. Sea ice obviously forms on top of the water, which is continually moving, and the result is amazing shapes and patterns, which could provide photographers with fun for hours and hours. And it was just a case of waiting in this snowstorm for a tiny break in the clouds and a little bit of light to catch the hillside. Occasionally, we did have some nice warm light, and that could be used to catch the edges of the patches of ice as they broke up, looking towards the land. On other occasions, there were cracks in the ice formed by the moving water, which gave nice leading lines, taking the eye towards the hillsides. But it's not all about the landscape, there's also the wildlife. when the sea ice is so extensive, it's very hard to get close to the wildlife because there is so much space for it to spread itself out in. But there were plenty of options of footprints of Arctic foxes that had been hunting, goodness knows for what, over these massive, massive stretches of sea ice. And we were very lucky and caught a view of this one nice evening. You do occasionally get off the boat onto a Zodiac, and again, that creates lots more opportunities for low angles. Although landscape pictures, it's quite difficult to get the horizon level as you bob up and down like a cork. But there are animals pulled out on the ice. There's not a lot of animals to see at this time of year, but you will find bearded seals pulled out on the ice. You can tell that this one has been resting there for a while because his beard is beginning to curl. They curl as they dry. And he just raised his head, looked at us, and then went back to sleep. There's also a few walruses about, mainly young males at this time of year, and they tend to haul out on the ice and like to cuddle up together. My daughter got engaged while we were away, and this was her engagement photo to a pair of walruses on the ice. I didn't tell her that they were both males. That many people think that when they see a walrus with a broken tusk, that it has happened in a fight. However, it's much more common to happen as they use the tusks to pull themselves up onto the ice. This was taken at about 11:30 or 12 o'clock at night as the light was just disappearing altogether, as he pulled himself out onto a floe of ice right next to the boat. But they do use them for a bit of tussle occasionally. So I had an absolutely wonderful holiday, but I was still absolutely convinced that our autumn trip wasn't going to work and that that's what I was going to get of the Arctic for the foreseeable future. So at that point, I put them together as a panel and submitted them for a fellowship. And not surprisingly, because I was quite stupid doing it, it failed, and I was told that there wasn't enough variation and that my statement was too factual. That was an interesting learning point. I'd been a doctor all my life, and my reports as a doctor were always very factual, and my feelings and emotions about what I was seeing were completely irrelevant, so were never included. And I produced the same sort of statement for my fellowship, and I didn't really understand why I needed to include anything else until I heard Simon Baxter, the landscape photographer specialising in woodland photography, talking about his book. Similar to me, he didn't want to include his emotional reactions in his book until somebody said to him, well, if you believe that creativity is partly about how you see the world, unless you include some information about how you see the world, how is anybody going to understand your work? And I suppose that's true. So next time I did include a bit of the fluffy stuff. Anyway, COVID didn't raise its head again. It went on reducing and we were allowed more freedom. And we did get to Svalbard again in the autumn. This time, a lot of the snow had blown off the mountains and the cliffs near to the coast were bare. There was a little bit of snow on the top still, but also a lot of geology that could be seen. The cliffs looking towards the sea had virtually no snow, so there was lots of opportunity to document some of the geological features that had shaped these beautiful lands. There was also, being in the north and being at the end of the season, close to the winter, more storms. Great. I liked photographing these. So we've had more light, more flat weather, more birds flying into compositions for me. You could get much closer to the glaciers at that time of year because a lot of the sea ice had gone from the fjords. So there were opportunities to document the bits of glacier that carved off floating out into the sea. And the larger front of the glacier, this is the longest ice front in the Northern Hemisphere. We had lots of dull days, lots of cloudy days, lots of days with interesting light. and I was able to put together another panel. This time I had a one-to-one with Paul Mitchell. Paul was great. He said, your first panel was much better. And I realised at that point that he was absolutely right. And I had taken to heart far too much of the comments made in the discussion between the assessors as they were looking at my first panel. And instead of trying to get across the message that I wanted to convey, I had inadvertently changed to trying to please the assessors. That was a mistake. Paul suggested that I went back to the first one and thought again. I did that and was delighted to pass on the second occasion. However, Svalbard's not just about the landscapes. I was delighted to get a landscape fellowship, but I also wanted to document some of the other stuff that was going on there. This is a perfect spot to look for wildlife. You've got a glacier running down to the sea. The glaciers scrape across the rocks, and as they do so, deposit lots of nutrients into the water. This encourages the growth of phytoplankton. You therefore get krill, crustaceans, small fish. And where you get krill and small fish, you will get seabirds. Where you get seabirds, you'll get Arctic foxes. And where you'll get krill, you will get whales. So this is a perfect place to spend some time. This I took at the bottom of the bird cliffs. I was spending a lot of time trying to be a little bit creative and leaning well over the side of the boat, getting my camera close to the water surface so that I could try and give the impression of the waves rolling a little bit with a wave coming up in front of the bird. Whilst doing so, I missed the most dramatic wildlife encounter that any of us saw on the trip. The Brunnich guillemots nest on the high cliffs, and when they're ready, the chicks have to jump off the cliffs and fall down into the water. This is before they can fly, and they then paddle away south with their fathers as their flight feathers develop and they can eventually become independent. Unfortunately, as they fall, occasionally another bird comes along and takes them, and this is what happened. A glaucous gull came along and took a chick that was falling, and everybody else got a very dramatic picture, but I didn't. Never mind. Where there are birds falling and occasionally not making it to the sea, and eggs, there will always be Arctic foxes. The foxes were just into their beautiful white cut coats for the winter and were roaming around at the bottom of the bird cliffs. They took absolutely no notice of a Zodiac boat cruising along the bottom of the cliffs, more intent on looking for food. Whales also frequent this beautiful fjord, and the humpback whale was circling round and round, hunting for small fish and krill over hours of that evening. And we were out taking photographs until well gone midnight. Walruses are also a fantastic animal. They did become one of my favourite wildlife animals during that trip because they are so inquisitive and curious. One isn't supposed to approach the wildlife. However, nobody told the walruses that. This was about 4 o'clock one morning. As you can see, there's a little bit of warm light there. But the reason we were out was that there was a polar bear resting on some ice a little farther away. We were sitting quietly in our Zodiac, wondering if the polar bear was going to move towards us. Meanwhile, the walruses were feeding from the shells on the bottom near the beach. They make an awful lot of noise, lot of belching, lot of farting, and very, very interested in their food. But once they'd finished feeding, they decided to take notice of these people in the Zodiac and came over to have a look. Came up right next to the boat and almost knocked my husband's camera out of his hand. The walruses, as the ice is cleared, are able to get onto the beaches, and the guides know where the haul-out spots are. They haul out and lie and molt for a while before they go back into the water. And if you're lucky, they can find you a spot where you can get up a little hill above the beach and take photographs from above. We also saw beluga whales, which is something I'd wanted to see for a long time, the canaries of the sea. And this pod went round and round and round for about 4 hours around this bay. But what everybody wants to see when they go to Svalbard is the polar bear. Now, polar bears, as everybody knows, feed mainly on seal, and the seals come out onto the sea ice. However, in the autumn, there's no sea ice, so the bears can't hunt seal. And the bears spend a lot of time sitting high up on the cliffs. This one was about 200, 250 feet up on a cliff overlooking the sea, just sitting and waiting and watching for the ice to reform. But if you notice, she doesn't look particularly thin. I went to Svalbard expecting that if we saw polar bears in the autumn, they would be thin, having been unable to hunt the seals for some time. However, that wasn't the case. What we did see was polar bears on reindeer carcasses, and the scientists in Svalbard have seen polar bears separate a weaker or sick reindeer from a herd, chase it into the sea, and they have their prey. We actually saw 4 polar bears on reindeer carcasses during our trip, which is probably why they didn't look very thin. However, the scientists are concerned that this may result in them getting an inappropriate balance of vitamins. However, I would have thought that it would be better to eat reindeer than no food. So that brings me to the end of our tour of Svalbard. And the next area we're going to talk about is the Falkland Islands. I'm not a sociable photographer. Having said that, I do go out on photo shoots with other people, but I always, if I find there's something that I want to take pictures of, prefer to go back on my own, which is when I would do my best work. So I wanted to go to the Falkland Islands, not on a group trip, but on our own. Falkland Islands are an archipelago in the South Atlantic. There's somewhere between 70 and 200 islands, and that depends on your definition of an island. There's an awful lot. Most of them are uninhabited. The population of the Falklands is about 2,500, most of whom live in Stanley, the main town, with a few working on farms and in the outlying islands. And there's also a population at the Mount Pleasance Air Base. Today, most of the money in the Falklands comes from fishery and tourism. Fishery supporting the fishing fleets that come down to the South Atlantic and providing health and safety training for them. And tourism, because a lot of the land has been overgrazed and no longer supports the numbers of sheep and cattle that managed to provide good income for the Falklanders in the past. They therefore have cut down dramatically the number of sheep and cattle on the land and turned to farming tourists. We'll see how they do that shortly. You can get to the Falklands if you want to go. If you don't want to go on a tour or a cruise, you can get there independently by flying on a commercial airline via Chile, or you can go, if you're in Britain, via Brize Norton on the military flight. It's a 20-hour flight, stopping for refueling at Cape Verde or Ascension Island if the runway at Ascension Island is functioning. The aeroplanes aren't the most comfortable. We went down on a second-hand Jet 2 aeroplane. The seats on the way out didn't even recline. However, it doesn't matter because they only take 25 paying passengers. That means that you invariably have 2 seats each, which makes up in great measure for the lack of reclining seats. Checking in is interesting. When you check in at RAF Brize Norton, you don't offer up your 100 mils of liquid, but you are expected to hand in any unused pyrotechnics. Coming back from Mount Pleasance, if you are carrying a mine, this needs to be declared to the security personnel. So we felt quite safe. Before you go, bird flu was obviously of concern, and we needed to use Virkon antiviral to clean our tripods, boots and sacks, anything that was going to touch the ground, and machine wash everything else. And this is checked when you arrive at the airport. When you get to Stanley, it's like a little British town. It's almost more British than the British. Beautifully clean, telephone boxes, red letter boxes, churches. Probably the whalebone arch wouldn't be seen in Britain. And a lot of the streets just look like something that could come out of a seaside town in England. But getting around is completely different. There's only one paved road in the Falklands and some dirt roads, but most of the movement between settlements is by aeroplane. If you're thinking of going, don't try and book your flights between the islands and your lodges up yourself. There's an agency in Stanley Island Services, who are wonderful. They will book everything up for you. And when, as inevitably happens at some point, a flight is cancelled because the aeroplane's broken down, which unfortunately they do, or the weather is too bad, which doesn't happen often because the pilots are quite amazing. On one of our flights, the aeroplane flew in at 45 degrees to the runway because the wind was so strong, only flipping to go parallel to the runway at the very last minute. But if that happens, Stanley Island Services just switch your bookings around and sort it all out for you, so there's no need to worry at all. And if you get an extra day on one island and an extra day less on another island, it doesn't matter because they're all fantastic. So these are some of the settlements that we stayed at. And as you see, the farm buildings have been converted into very nice tourist accommodation. However, if you're into photographing decaying architecture, there's lots of that to do as well. And this is another settlement on which we stayed. This 10-mile long island was owned by one farmer who'd been there all his life and now invited tourists into his home. But what you're there for is the wildlife. And it's absolutely fantastic to be on a beach with thousands of penguins and nobody else. I told you I didn't like photographing with people, but this is amazing. We were there for 2.5 weeks, and I think we might have met 3 other people on beaches at one time or another. And apart from that, we had beaches and wildlife to ourselves. I thought you might like to know how Moby Dick might have seen a penguin. So Herman Melville tells us, what curious little beings they are, neither fish, nor flesh, nor fowl. Without exception, it's the most outlandish creature yet discovered by man. And nature keeps these ungainly children hidden away at the ends of the earth. Absolutely true. So photographing penguins is amazing fun. You can just sit on the edge of the sea and the Gentoo penguins will come charging in, and they come charging in very close to you. They're rushing in to get back to their chicks to feed them some regurgitated krill, and really are in a hurry. They nest in colonies, sometimes half a mile, 3/4 of a mile away from the beach, and they have highways which they walk up and down to get to the sea. The highways aren't particularly photogenic, covered with splats of guano and regurgitated krill, but the behavior on them is amazing. You can sit there and watch the penguins chasing the adults to try to get them to regurgitate food. These are probably chasing the wrong adult, as she doesn't seem at all keen to feed them. And sometimes as they get bigger, they come down the highway and meet the parent and get fed before the parent gets back to the colony. But as they get bigger, the chicks get more brave and sometimes venture as far as the beach, which makes for much better backgrounds, especially if the tide has just gone out and washed the beach clean. You shouldn't anthropomorphize, but you can just imagine that the parent was teaching the chick to swim. The chick was chasing after the parent, trying to get it to regurgitate food, and the parent, seemingly very deliberately, ran along the edge of the sea and then swerved into it. The chick plunged into the water and then shook itself, came out very disgruntled, and feeling very sorry for itself, you'd have thought. It then begged for food and was rewarded with a meal. If you notice the eyes of the penguins, you virtually never see a catchlight in their eyes. This is because the cornea, the front part of the eye, is very flat because they need to be able to see extremely well underwater and in the air. And having a flat cornea facilitates that, although it's not great for photography. It's not advised to use flash, otherwise you could catch a bit. Another way to make more aesthetically pleasing pictures is to pick a beach which has just been washed by the tide, but then a little bit of focus stacking. This was a 500mm lens taken from lying on sand a good way back, and it would have been impossible to get the penguin and the rock in focus at the same time. So 2 pictures stacked. Another way to try and get some nice clean foreground is to lie on the beach when it's dry. And when it's dry, it's usually very windy in the Falklands. The wind picks up the sand and creates a nice soft foreground for you. Although it can be a bit much for the steamer ducks. The other thing you want to see in the foreground in the Falklands are elephant seals. These young males are jousting. The big males have already gone back to sea, and if you want to see them, you need to go before Christmas. But this time there are still some males who want to practice their skills. And there's females who are molting and just waiting for their skin to fall off before they can go back to sea again, which the tussock birds enjoy. They can get a little bit of extra protein from some of the dead skin falling off. Back to the beach. Well, the gentoo aren't the only penguins that we saw. The Magellanics have a completely different character. They're much more slow, much more sedate, and look much more grown up. They walk slowly up and down to their colonies. But the main problem with these is that they nest in burrows. It's not a problem for them, but it was a problem for me. On most of the days while we were away, I wore windproof walking trousers and a fairly thick windproof jacket. However, on this particular day, it was considerably warmer, maybe about 16 degrees, and I decided, without thinking very hard, to put on a pair of lightweight tracksuit trousers and lay down to photograph these. Well, penguin mites and fleas do very well in burrows rather than the open air, and I had hundreds of bites on my legs and had to keep getting up to put soothing compresses on them for the next 2 nights. The other thing about the Magellanic penguins is that if you are staying in a lodge nearby, you won't get much sleep. They're called jackass penguins locally because they make a noise that sounds like a donkey braying, and it sounds exactly like a donkey braying. And they do it until the light is completely gone and at first light again in the morning. Rockhoppers are the next sort of penguin that you're able to see on the Falklands. Rockhoppers live on the tops of cliffs and often nest with other birds, so they're here with an imperial cormorant. This gives them some extra protection. Rockhoppers do exactly what it says on the tin and hop. They're wonderful to watch. But as they come in from the sea, you wonder how they survive. They come out of the boiling waters and look as if they're going to be thrashed against the rocks, but leap out and climb up the incredibly steep slopes by holding on only with their claws and their beaks, and hop all the way up to their nest top colonies, arriving with great relief, I'm sure. Then they stomp off with the chick who's come down to meet them to the colony, to the chick that's still waiting. The rockhopper colonies are amazing places, absolutely full of noise and vitality. They squabble all the time and make an awful lot of noise, whether they're squabbling about who's going to feed this chick or who's stolen stone from whose nest, who knows. Sometimes people ask me whether you can eat penguin. Well, it's illegal, so you can't eat it, but that's only been since 1959. Before that, the considered eating penguin, and this is part of a book written by the cook at Port Lockroy, which is one of the previous British Antarctic Survey bases on the Antarctic Peninsula. FID is what the British Antarctic Survey was previously known at. And the cook said, this is going to be a fairly short chapter for several reasons, mainly because I don't like the stuff. Also, when cooking penguin, I have an awful feeling inside of me that I'm cooking little men that are just a little bit too curious and a little bit too stupid. I did have one pop into the kitchen once just to see what was going on. And at first I thought, how nice to have your meal come to the pot in such a fresh state. But alas, I didn't have the heart to do it in. And that brings us on to king penguins, which are the last species that we saw a lot of on the Falkland Islands. There's a colony at Victory Point on the main Falkland Island, but there's no road to it. It requires you to hire a Land Rover and a driver. It's an hour on dirt roads, followed by 2 hours across completely roadless diddly-dee, which is similar to heather, to get to the colony. King penguin colonies are great. They're really interesting because the king penguin has a 15-month breeding cycle. That means you can see all parts of the cycle at the same time in the same colony. So you can see courtship, you can see mating, you can see penguins with eggs on their feet. They don't have nests like the emperors. They store their eggs in the brood pouch on their feet. As they get a little bit bigger, if the weather's not too cold, they seem to stick their bombs out. For some reason, at that stage, they seem to keep their heads carefully buried under their parents' skirts. However, as they get a bit bigger, out they come, ugly little things that they are. And as they get bigger still, both parents are then able to go off to sea to fish, to come back and provide food for their increasing needs. Bigger still, they molt their soft down and put on waterproof feathers so that eventually they will be able to go to sea. Photographing the colony has got some challenges because they're so tightly packed together, and like the Gentoo colonies, the foregrounds aren't particularly photogenic. But periodically you will get one that suddenly stretches itself up and starts to call for its mate or its chick. And sometimes it finds its chick and then starts to regurgitate the food. On other occasions, they're all hunkered down, all quiet, and then suddenly one pulls itself up and charges through the whole colony on its way out to the sea. At the beach, you get more photogenic opportunities and are able to lie flat on the beach again, waiting for them to come past. Now, these started about 100 yards away from me, and as you can see, they got too close, so I missed the feet. Again, you can use the blown sand to create some nice soft foregrounds and more appealing images. And you can use the sea as the background, and the colours are about right. The sea really was that colour. The other thing that you mustn't miss if you go to the Falklands are the albatross. We went to an albatross colony, a short boat ride away on an uninhabited, or an island inhabited only by one man, to see an albatross colony. It's all fenced off, so obviously you don't want to go too close. But sitting there, watching and waiting, an albatross came and landed right next to me. What an amazing experience to be sitting there and this huge bird suddenly plops down right beside you. Beautiful big chicks. And it's some lovely interactions with the parents. So that brings us on to this year. About this time last year, my husband John and I were out with a friend talking about, we all retired about the same age, talking about what we were doing with our retirement and what we were going to do. And very sadly, 6 weeks later, we were at his funeral. We decided that we'd get on and do the things that we wanted to do while we were fit to do it. And these sort of holidays do take a bit of energy, and you need to be reasonably fit to make the most out of them. So 2 days later, an advert from the same Norwegian company that we had been with in the spring in 2022 appeared in my inbox. So we were tempted. If you think about going to the Antarctic, it's worth considering what you actually want to get out of it. We had been some years ago as a retirement treat in Shackleton's footprint circuit. So we'd been to South Georgia, the South Shetlands and the Antarctic Peninsula. And that is an amazing experience if you want to get a bit of a feel for what Shackleton and his men suffered and endured. We were really lucky and got to stand on Elephant Island. It was a small 100-person ship on that occasion, and the leader of the expedition had been 28 times to Elephant Island and only managed to land twice, and ours was the second time. And I got a real kick out of standing where those men stood under their upturned boat for 4 months, waiting for Shackleton, hoping that Shackleton would come back and rescue them. So that sort of trip is well worth considering if you are interested in the history as well as the wildlife and the landscape, and I would highly recommend it. However, the disadvantage is that you spend more time at sea crossing over to South Georgia, and you visit fewer spots on the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's worth thinking about what you want to get out of it. The other thing that you need to consider is how big a ship you want to go on. As I said, the ship that we went on previously had 100 passengers, and that meant there's a little bit more flexibility about the things you can do. And so it's worth thinking what you want to get out of it. On that occasion, we'd opted to do a bit of sea kayaking as well as photography, and that was an amazing experience. To be kayaking in the middle of one of these bays in that sort of scenery, and this is me in my boat, was absolutely incredible experience. However, as I've said, I'm quite an antisocial photographer, and I don't like being with a lot of other photographers, so I wanted a small ship. We arrived in Ushuaia and walked onto the quay. We passed the boats that took 200 passengers down there. Then we walked past the boats that took 100 passengers down there. And then we saw our little tiny boat at the end, and my husband said, "You're not booking any more holidays. Do you realise we've got to go across Drake's Passage in that?" I said, "It'll be fine, don't worry about it." Well, it would have been fine if a storm hadn't caught up with us on the way across Drake's Passage. We had 10-metre waves. That meant that lying in bed at night, you suddenly shot down your bed by about 2 feet and then rocked back up again. The drawers in our cupboards flew out of the cupboards in the middle of the night with our possessions flying around the room, and my camera bag slid across the floor. The captain had to radio the owners of the ship and said, "It's not possible to go south. We need to run with the wind for a few hours." So that's what we did. He turned the boat and we ran west with the wind, east with the wind for a few hours. They then said, "Go somewhere where you can hold on and stay there." So we all did that, and they turned through the wind and headed back into the wind for another 8 hours. It wasn't nearly as scary as I had anticipated, and I really wouldn't have any qualms about going in a small boat again. And it had an advantage. We ended up farther south in the Weddell Sea than we had intended, which meant we were near Snow Hill Island, which is where the most accessible emperor penguin colony is. There were no birds at the colony currently because it's not the right time of year. However, we did see 3 juvenile emperor penguins on the ice as we approached the continent. Absolutely amazing, and I hadn't even dared hope that we'd see those. The weather wasn't great as we arrived, and I was absolutely delighted that we had picked the Norwegian team to look after us. The guides on the expedition were absolutely fantastic. They were Norwegians, very, very comfortable with managing risk in an Arctic environment. So the Antarctic was really no problem to them. They took us out in Zodiacs on the first day when it was really still pretty rough. We put all our gear into dry bags, sealed them tightly, covered ourselves completely in waterproofs, and still got absolutely soaked on our way to the shore. But by the time we came back from the shore, it had dropped and it was fine. I'm quite sure that many other companies wouldn't have taken passengers out in those sorts of conditions. So I was delighted that we had chosen them. We had variable weather throughout the trip, and this was one of the most fabulous wildlife encounters of my entire life. We were sitting in the middle of a bay. It was snowing heavily, and you know when it's snowing and you get that muffled sort of quietness, and all you could hear was the gentle lapping of the water against the edge of the Zodiac. And then you started hearing some huge bubbles come up out of the depths. And we were suddenly surrounded by 5 humpback whales who were bubble net fishing, which means they dive down, they blow bubbles to confuse the fish. And then when the fish are confused and corralled, they come up and gulp them down. That really is one of the most memorable wildlife experiences we have ever had. The light was pretty flat on many occasions, and everything seemed very monochromatic. There really isn't a lot of colour except a bit of blue in the ice and a little bit of yellow in the sky. And you're back to, similar to in the Arctic, waiting for little bits of light to hit islands and taking pictures of the amazing cloudscapes that you get down there. Sometimes when the cloud's a bit thinner, you can see bits of mountains peeping through. And flat light is ideal for the iceberg graveyard. Icebergs the size of tower blocks fall off some of the glaciers into the ocean and float outwards. But here they come to an underground moraine bank, which is rocks that were put there by the glacier as it receded. The icebergs become grounded on the moraine bank, which means they're stable and they're no longer at risk of toppling over and causing damage or danger to boats in the area. It's therefore safe to traverse them in your little Zodiac, and you can go in and out of what's like an ice city of bergs. An amazing experience. We did get a little bit of soft light early one morning in the Lemaire Channel, but most of the time the light was quite flat, which is absolutely perfect for photographing wildlife. It would be really difficult to get pictures like this if the light was harsh and bright. And then we saw Adelie penguins. So Adelie penguins live further south than the other species that we'd previously seen, and we hadn't ever encountered those before. And they are fantastic, comical little birds. They all bunch up on the beach. They don't go in one at a time. They all go in together, because in the water around the edge of the colonies, there will be leopard seals waiting for an Adelie meal. You can get onto the land on the peninsula, and before you go down there, you need to be well prepared. You obviously need to do the same Virkon treatment that we did for the Falkland Islands, but as well as that, you need to hoover out your camera bags, hoover out your pockets, clean your Velcro around the edges of your outdoor gear, around your cuffs and your bottoms of your waterproof. You need to pick out anything that might be a grass seed before you go. And that's all checked when you get onto the boat. They really make a huge effort to make sure that no invasive species get onto the Antarctic. So you're very happy to let them examine every pocket. This year, on the land, both in South Georgia and on the Antarctic Peninsula, you have to touch the ground only with your feet. You can't sit, you can't kneel, you can't lie down, you can't put your gear down. You have to carry everything in your hands all the time, which is quite hard work if you've got 2 cameras, lenses, and you can't put it down to switch things around, but that's what you have to do. when you get back onto the boat and before you leave the boat, your boots go through a tub of Virkon again, and you get power hosed. Your trousers and shoes get power hosed to make sure that you're not spreading anything. The guides weren't really terribly sure how useful that was, because you see skewers moving from colony to colony. However, we were more than happy to do our bit. When you do get on land, it's another amazing experience. The rocks where they nest are stained slightly pink with regurgitated krill, and there's penguins everywhere. You can see them building their nests with stones. Now, even if they have built a nest already, they'll still go and steal stones from other birds' nests. So there's a continual movement of the stones from nest to nest throughout the colony. And even though you can't get yourself into a low position to get low angles, it's fairly easy to find birds that are on a little rock ledge or an area higher than you, and get some good clear shots of them. So there's some Adelie penguins feeding their chicks, and chinstrap penguins, which are another species of the Antarctic Peninsula. Again, a very snowy, foggy day. But I was quite keen to get some more artistic pictures with some nice clean foregrounds, so looked for a chute of ice where there was a possibility of penguins walking up, and wait for the penguin to come and stand in a nice position for me. Other opportunities were when you were in your zodiac. If you were lucky, you would get a small group of penguins porpoising as they traverse the water, and they do that quite often as they're coming in very fast, and get pictures of them, although it's quite difficult in a little boat that's bobbing up and down like a cork. Again, a low angle below the birds that are nesting on little rocky cliff bits to get a low angle and nice soft light. And when it's foggy, that can help to reduce the contrast in the background as well. But I was quite keen to take some pictures which gave me a feel of the distance that these little birds have to walk, and the loneliness of the places in which they live. And some Adelies walking up to their nests across the ice. It's also fun to try and catch pictures of them diving in. The non-breeding birds seem to spend a lot of time sitting on ice floes, and periodically they'll all decide to dive in. So you have a few opportunities to get a picture of them as they go in. But the reason they're going in groups is because these fellows are about. These are the leopard seals, and they have a fearsome reputation, partly because they have this really wicked grin on their face all the time. Most of the time you see them, they're lazing about on an ice floe, digesting a meal of penguin, and lazily lift their head to have a look at you as you pass by. Another one digesting its penguin meal. But occasionally they will come and have a look at you, and this one was particularly curious. Late one night, just as the light was fading, we were out and about in our zodiac, inspecting the iceberg graveyard, and he came really close up to the boat and then jumped at least 2.5 foot in the air, and almost looked as though he was going to jump into the boat, almost knocking my camera out of my hand, too close to get a picture. The other animal that you see a fair amount of is the fur seal. There are only young males here at the moment. If you want to see breeding fur seals and pups, you need to go to the subantarctic islands. Here there were young males, and this one had decided to have a rest on a nice ice floe, and another male came along to join in. At first there was a little bit of a squabble, but they sorted it out, and after 10-15 minutes they both went back into the water and swam off together. The other thing that you can take pictures of is to try and do some more abstract images of the ice. This is an iceberg which has obviously been upended in the water at some point because it's all smoothed off. And another picture of the ice, and maybe some kelp gulls on the ice, and then perhaps to create a triptych from them. So that is a very brief summary of our 3 trips. However, I felt at this point that I wanted to do something more with my photography. I had got lots of pictures which I didn't really want just to stay on my hard drive, and I felt that I had something to say about the weather, the landscape in polar regions, and the creatures that make these inhospitable lands their home. So I have produced a book which contains not just my fellowship panel images, but also images of the landscape and wildlife of the Svalbard archipelago and the Antarctic Peninsula. And I'm selling that. The entire purchase price of the book is going to go to crisis.org, because I feel that I'm very lucky to have been able to go on these trips, and I would like the book to work for somebody that's less fortunate. So the entire purchase price, not just the profit, is going to go to the charity. And if anybody would like to have a look at a few preview pages, there's some on my website and my email address, and those will be in the information that goes out after the show. So we did get some nice light one evening, late at night, about 11 o'clock, just before the sun went down. And that closes my talk about the Arctic, Antarctic and the Falklands. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has got any.
Well, thank you, Jean. There's some lovely pictures in there. I think that last one in the top of your triptych reminded me of a bird, the ice floe. Maybe it was just me. No?
Yes, you're probably quite right, Trevor.
Yeah, that's what it looked like. A bit abstract, so it was quite interesting. Anyway, thank you for that, as I say, Jean. So now is the time for you to ask your questions. We've got one which I'll kick off with in a minute, but if you've got any more, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, or as I've said, maybe the top if you're using a tablet. As I also said, if you want to comment on today's event or send your thanks, please do save that for the survey, which will be coming out in a few days' time. Questions only for now, please. And the first one we got is from Morris. And he says, which Svalbard trip did you find to be the most productive photographically, spring or autumn?
Well, it depends what you want. Landscape-wise, I preferred the spring. I think the spring really, the ice and the snow was absolutely amazing. If you want to see more wildlife, then an autumn trip is good, because you've not got the extent of the sea ice and you therefore have got more opportunities. If I was to go again, I think I would probably opt for something like May, where you'd probably have both. So if I was only going once, I think it would be May.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any more questions to come in? We only have that one at the moment. It was a very comprehensive talk. So does anybody have any more questions they'd like to ask Jean, please? If you could click on the Q&A icon. Oh, one more's come in from Lillian. And she says, when did they introduce not being able to put anything down in Antarctica?
This year, this season.
That's very new then. And a question from Paul. Right. What would you recommend as one lens to use if you had to take just one?
Ooh, I couldn't. I took in the Arctic, I used mainly 100 to 500 and a 28 to 105. When the picture that I wished I had been able to do slightly differently in my panel was a small iceberg in Antarctica, and because you're moving such a lot in the boat, by the time I'd straightened it, it was a little bit tight. So when I went to the Antarctic, I took 16 to 35, which was great on the zodiacs. So I couldn't choose, but I would definitely want to take both 16 to 35 and 100 to 500.
Fair enough. And I've got a question from Sylvie. She says, could you explain about managing the decisive moment and the parameters that you set your camera while a boat is in movement?
For wildlife, I use a rapid fire for most of the time. For landscape, it's just a one click, one picture.
Okay. Janet, on the panelists, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask something, or is that just a...
Yes, I do, please.
Far away then.
I don't have the ability to type a question in, so my apologies.
All right. Okay, far away then, please.
Jean, in one of your photographs, you had 2 baby chicks chasing after a parent who you said you didn't think was the mother. I always thought penguins only had 1 chick each. Is that correct?
No, we quite often have 2. We've been told different things about them chasing the mothers. So the first time I went to the Falklands, I was told that the parents got the chicks to chase them before they feed them, because that's a way of building their muscle up before they go to sea. However, the alternative view is that they're chasing the wrong parent, and their right parent isn't going to feed them. So whether both is right or either, I don't know.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, there's no more open questions. So does anybody have any more questions before we move on to the end of the evening? Nothing at the moment, but something might crop up while I'm doing my wrap up. So Jean, once again, thank you very much indeed. There's some stunning pictures there. Now, I've no doubt that your book will be full of some of those spectacular images, and we will be sending out the information on how people can buy a copy of that in this follow-up email. I mean, there's some information on screen at the moment, but don't rush to write it all down. It will be all coming out in the email, so you'll be able to easily purchase one of them with no problem at all. RPS Digital Imaging is very glad that you joined us this evening for this event. Thanks for coming along. We, as usual, have many more in the pipeline. Now, if you're not already a member, you will find that even though the fee for non-members is low, if you are an RPS member, you'll probably save money by joining Digital Imaging as a digital-only member. In a few weeks' time, we have the popular Judy Hancock Holland returning on Saturday the 22nd of June, and she'll be giving us an in-depth look at how to constructively critique yours and others' images in her talk, Critiquing Photos, Your Own and Others. Then on the 27th of July, we have Rad Drew, who's going to tell us how to create IR images using your smartphone. Now, we hope you can join us for these, both which promise to be really interesting meetings. As usual, the arrangements can be found on the RPS Digital Imaging website, so you can find the booking information there and how to get tickets. So if there are no more questions, and I don't think we have any more, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed, Jean. That's a fascinating evening. And in the meantime, everybody, happy shooting and good night. And we'll see you at another meeting. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for me for coming as well. And thank you to the team.